Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. It's beautiful. You read most of my favorite poems.
I'm happy to hear that.
That was great. But first of all, I don't know how you do it. I mean, you're a professor at Princeton. You're the U.S. Poet Laureate, and you're going everywhere for that. You're the mother of 3 children, including a set of young twins. And you travel and perform, and you have projects, and so on. So, and then you just gave a wonderful performance, and now you're about to be interviewed. And I think maybe you need to rest. You just sit here for a while, and maybe just sit here and visit.
Okay.
Yeah, we'll try to do it.
Sounds good.
Let's sit here and visit, like we're on the front porch, you know? And yeah, imagine this is the front porch, and you guys have all got, you know, it's warm, you got tea and everything. So anyway, I just, last fall, my graduate class focused on poetic memoir, and we read a lot of texts, including Ed Hirsch's Gabriel, Elizabeth Alexander's wonderful memoir, Light of the World, in Scott Momaday's book, Way to Rainy Mountain, which I teach as poetic memoir, and your memoir, Ordinary Spirit. And early on in my reading of your memoir, I remember sitting down to read it, and then I realized I was resisting you at first. And that surprised me, and it's beautiful writing, and I realized it was because you reminded me of my sister in a way, that you were the youngest. And the youngest always has a special place, and there I was, the older sister who made the path through my rebellion, the rebellion path. But then as I continued your memoir, reading your story, you had me, because it felt like suddenly, and this is how you want a book to feel, a book of poetry, a memoir, like I was with you, and I was in those intimate spaces of growing up and questioning, because really that's what makes a poet, is those questions of the holy. And so you were intrigued, and you questioned doctrines that tightened your spirit, and then every touchstone poet or poem you had, that was mine too. I kept, the Song of Solomon in the Bible, I used to read that in church when I get bored during the sermon. Really, yeah. And then Lucille Clifton, and especially the Emily Dickinson poem, I'm Nobody, Who Are You? I love that poem so much. It's in my, I put the whole poem in my next collection. Oh. But reading that poem when I was 8 years old, and it was one of the first times, and I love poetry, and my mom wrote songs, and I love lyrics, and I loved listening to those. But it was the first time in a poem that I'd read that I felt personally invited in to that private space, like somebody was speaking to me.
Yeah. And
I wanted you to comment maybe on your mutual appreciation of that poem, and also reading poetry younger, because there's some younger people out here too.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that poem really, it feels like somebody has kind of cornered you and then told you everything that you have not brought into language about who you are. I'm nobody, who are you? Are you nobody too? Then there's a pair of us, don't tell. Suddenly you're validated, and you're invited into some sort of a pact or something. I loved that feeling. It also was exciting. I felt, as a kid, oh, here's an adult who's interested in me. Yeah. Here's somebody who recognizes something. I think we all crave that, but I think as children, it's really meaningful when that happens, and to see it happen in a poem that I could return to, that I could keep inside of me, it felt huge. It felt like an example of what I wanted to be able to do when I grew up.
So did you start writing poetry shortly after that? I know you were
same day.
Yeah, that same day.
I wrote a very bad poem that day, but what I feel like I was saying was, I want to do this. I loved reading poetry, and most of the time I didn't know. If you asked me what the poem was about, I wouldn't have been able to really say much, but I loved the different space language could take you to, rhythmically and musically, looking at something that seemed invisible before, and I would open books and want to feel that. And when I really got serious about trying to write poems, I think it was wanting to create a version of that, wanting to be able to take myself somewhere and use language coming out of my own mouth to teach me something that I didn't know, which is, I think, what poetry does.
Yeah, there's something about that kind of space. We were talking earlier about it being a space where there's your father again. Mm-hmm. You can walk. I love that line, the mystery. Poems are places where the mystery between us is made smaller, as you said when talking about mm-hmm. your father. Mm-hmm. So they do become, places that hold spirit in a way.
Yeah, I think poems take us to our larger selves. It's like we live with something around us or in us that we don't recognize, but it's us. It's mm-hmm. more us than we are. And poems, I think, are one of the things that lets us kind of get closer to that, to listen, maybe without even knowing, but to listen to that largeness. And I think we just need that. We need that because just about everything else I can think of in our culture is in the business of making us small.
That's true, yeah. Yeah, because language can either enlarge the feeling and make you want to, like the woman telling you she loved you. Mm-hmm. And a poem can do that. Or the language is a kind of political rhetoric that divides you and mm-hmm. makes you hate each other.
Yeah, or makes you think, this is what category I fit into, this is what I want, this is what my life's supposed to be like, okay, I'll just do that.
Right, it becomes, stereotype for particular tropes or so mm-hmm. on, yeah. So there's a lot of young people out here and older people, because sometimes you don't start writing till later. I didn't start playing saxophone when I was almost 40, and I felt like I was late getting started writing poetry, but they're just starting to write. And you said a lot of things, but about a poem being this large, and I know when I write a poem, it's like if I think I know what I'm doing, then I'm out of luck already. I've learned that the hard way. but getting there, you're sitting there with I didn't say a piece of paper in my generation, or mm-hmm. a blank screen. I do both, but how do you find the poem, and how do you challenge mm-hmm. yourself to go beyond what you do? And technically, your craft is impeccable, and how do you balance all of that? Because one requires this immense, mm-hmm. tightening, and the other part you can't think about that at all.
Yeah, it's like this sort of meticulous
yeah.
control and gross abandon,
Yeah.
reckless abandon. I love that a poem allows me to work in both modes, which I think, are innate to all of us. Mm-hmm. So I start out with what I know. Usually what I know is a question or an image, and I take a step or two or three into that, and then I realize I don't know what else to say or do. I go back and I see if there's something that I've said that I can make better use of, and I move forward thinking in terms of sound, thinking visually, because it helps me to imagine that I'm someplace I can see, and then listening for ideas that I can build upon. And I feel best when I'm farthest from what feels safe. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking, there's a linear wish that I have, like sometimes I think if I were smarter, I would have studied philosophy and I would be a philosopher or something, but I can write poems and they can help me try and ask very simple linear questions about life. But the answer often emerges, or possibilities emerge from sort of zigzagging through things that shouldn't belong together, yeah. That associative kind of like movement. And so I'm trying to listen to ways that I can build upon that too. And for me, that means I look at like nouns and verbs and say, okay, well, I'm using these things in a very direct, literal way. I'm not getting enough mileage out of them that way. So maybe I can use them in a way that's more rooted in a metaphor, in the wrong context, and bring some sort of associative energy, movement, speed, and possibility into the poem that way.
Okay. I'm stuck. I know. You know, when you said linear wish, I stayed there. That's the poet in me. I was, you know, and then I was zigzagging.
Well, that's what
thinking
like,
about linear
like,
wish.
Sometimes when you're in poetry reading, that happens. Like you hear an image and it opens this portal for you, but the poet keeps reading.
Yes.
And then you have to get back there.
It happens in conversation too.
Yeah, but that's the really interesting kind of covering of ground that, you know, I love catching up and saying, oh wait, I'm going to bring this there. So, yeah.
Okay. So we all have ancestors, and I tell they inspire, teach, and even haunt us. And as poets, we have poetry ancestors. Some are poets we know or have known or are just ahead of us generationally, or others continue far back through the generational line. And some we don't even know their names. We just inherit their muscle, their tendencies, their sound pattern proclivities. Your poetry ancestors include Emily Dickinson, Seamus Heaney, who, you know, I'm envious that you got to work with him, and who leads us directly to Yeats, and then Philip Larkin, Rita Dove, and so on. But is there someone who's had the most influence on you, and have you ever had a falling out with any one of them?
Oh, yeah. Wow, that's a good question.
I'm talking on an imaginary level.
Well, I have always loved Elizabeth Bishop. And when I started reading her, when I first started writing poems, I liked her control. Yeah. That's what I wanted to step into. Yeah. And I found that the wish to have and exercise control prevented me from writing poems because I didn't have control. Yeah. I didn't have answers. I couldn't make authoritative statements. And so then I kind of turned against her for a little while. Now I read and love her, and I see what I was blind to before, which was that this incredible, you know, her ability to build the world so perfectly in description, to anchor these poems to this really solid mechanism, is the tool with which she was able to plunge or attempt to plunge into the mess of, you know, love, loss, desire, just the blur of wanting to be like claimed and changed by the world that you can see so clearly, but that, you know, there's more to. And I love now her poems for this extreme vulnerability and the courage to break out of order and to get to something that defies explanation, thinking of that wonderful poem At the Fish Houses, which I love so much, which becomes this rhythmic incantation. And so, you know, we've made up. We're back together. But I think any time that I've turned against a poet that I love, it's because I couldn't see the fullness. You know, I could only see one small thing. And taking some steps back has made me able to see a little bit more. And I'm sure there will be more that I come to sing. Yeah, usually there's something in them that's a lot like you that you don't want to see. Okay, I have a lot of questions here. It looks like a dissertation. So I was wondering, sometimes I think of poetic structure as ceremonial, like the title gives you the door, and the first line opens the door, and then each step is kind of a journey of the becoming of the poem, and the speaker can be coming apart or entering myriad pathways on the way to the last line, and in some kinds of poetry, you don't have a last line. There's never any way out. You know, it just depends. And this can be true of the structure of a book.
And so I wonder about your sense of processing and how that's changed from your, putting a poem, I mean, every poem is different. But is there a process, and how has your process maybe of writing poetry changed from the body's question to even what you're writing now?
I love that idea of the ceremony, because it also means that there's an order, there's a pattern, but there's also something that defies that is the life of the thing, right? The first poems that I wrote that I thought were real poems are rooted in statement. And then I got, I felt more comfortable looking around and bringing image into the poem, but it's really those two things. I think the body's question is me learning to do those two things. I think the poems that I feel the poems that I'm writing differently, and I feel like one of the central mechanisms is sound and rhythm. They still sound like me, but I feel that the engine driving them is not up here. It's more in the body, I think. It feels like a pulse. I think it makes space for things that I don't understand to come into the poems sometimes. That little catalog of apostrophe toward the end of Wade in the Water, oh. I didn't know where that was coming from when I wrote the poem. Now I can very clearly see those words are coming from almost like a scene of escape. Tree, gun, dogs, girl, run. All of this seemed to emerge up from beneath the poem or something. And that was my clue that the poem was arriving somewhere. And I like to have that feeling.
Yeah, I love that. I have a whole question about that. I love that. You know what it reminded me of? Well, there's two things. I don't want to lose track here. Because one references what you were talking about, the earth. Because the earth does speak, and there it is, and it does hold our history, it holds our blood, it holds our bones, it holds our stories, our actions, and what we've done. But when I heard that, and I loved hearing you read that, I thought of the end of Toni Morrison's Sula, when it's one of my favorite book endings. "Oh Lord, Sula," she cried, "girl, girl, 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 girl." There was a fine cry, loud and long, but it had no bottom and it had no top, just circles and circles of sorrow. And I heard that and I thought, it's beautiful how that continues, and it's a similar kind of land and a similar kind of place. And the grief, I think of the water, because water is the emotional carrier of the earth. And so on. And then I hear you talking about moving where there's actually grass and, plants and animals, and it does change because it is whole. It's how we know ourselves, really. And then I hear this coming up from the earth. So I guess I moved away from my question, but I wondered about the influence of, Toni Morrison
Gosh.
Yeah, people ask me my poetry influence. I always say Toni Morrison because I feel like she's a novelist, but she writes poetry.
Oh, absolutely. And she builds those books doing the impossible.
Yeah.
There's, the work of narrative and history and conscience, but then these radical shifts. Oh, the narrator suddenly becomes a concept, or there's something magical that happens. You get rooted in the concerns, the real, so that you can be lifted out of it and see, evidence of it in you, on you. I love her, and she terrifies me.
Yeah, I'm scared of her too. Yeah. But I admire her.
Yeah, and to think that I don't know how I finally allowed myself to try and write about slavery, knowing that the masterpiece that, you know, beloved exists, or even a mercy. But yeah, I mean, it's exciting to kind of like move toward what has been built so beautifully, and to say I'm gonna just tinker with this one little thing and see what happens.
It's so difficult to put into words what can't be spoken. I mean, well, you think of grief. You think of the history of this country. That's all of us. It's not, you know, it's all our history. You know, and how do you put that into words, and how do you tell these stories? And I see that happening in Wade in the Water. So it comes up in, it's like finding our pieces when, you know, like when I return to the South and see the American Holocaust of our people. And I think, well, things come up in slivers. You find slivers of pottery, like finding shards. It comes up in shards. Well, one thing, you can't deal with it all at once. It's too, you cannot bear it.
Yeah, and a shard you can hold.
Yeah, you can hold that.
I feel like that's the whole the enterprise of poetry is to bring into language that which doesn't fit, you know, and it's the large public stuff, but it's also the inescapable private stuff too. You know, we have these powerful feelings, and they don't fit in simple speech. And poetry performs this miracle.
Yeah.
Says, I can talk about this thing by talking about this thing, and that's going to give you a really close sense to the, you know, upheaval or the joy or the wonder that I am subject to, you know.
So there's all these pieces, all these poems, and they all kind of fit together in a way. So I had a final, boy, we've got a little bit, I have too many more questions. We're going to have to keep going. No? I love that you said in Duende in Duende I kept seeing these hints of life on Mars. I knew you were going to take off. When I was reading those, it's like, okay, you know, here's the body and here's Duende and we're here, but we have to leave for a while to really understand and get that perspective and look back. And so now I'm thinking with Wade in the Water, and then there's the earth and Watershed. I think Watershed is one of the most powerful political and eco-political poems I've come across. It's an out-of-body near-death experience. It's an out-of-body near-death experience winds through the testimony of a destroyed watershed. I mean, what a construct. A destroyed family from chemical manufacture. The architecture really makes this poem, and it is personal. There's so many, many personals as well as transcendental. And I was wondering about the process of that poem, or how you found that. And then I keep thinking of nature, one of the few remaining sites of the holy. And I was amazed by that poem.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
That poem, half of that poem is found. It comes from an article by Nathaniel Rich about DuPont chemical companies' unconscionable, surreptitious, toxic dumping that has, not only did it destroy this particular watershed, but it's everywhere. It's gotten into the ocean, you know, wildlife. We have this chemical in us that's terrible. And I knew I wanted to figure out how to wrestle with that in a poem, but I just clipped this article and I didn't know what to do with it. And then I had this other space that was so compelling to me, which was the near-death experience narratives, which are they're fascinating. It's basically if somebody dies on the operating table or has a heart attack and flatlines for like a minute, oftentimes or sometimes people believe they go into the light, they're greeted by these spirit beings, they come to understand something about themselves, about the world, and then they understand that they need to go back because they have work to do. It's like across cultures and belief systems, this is a recurring narrative. And that made so much sense to me.
Yeah.
And then this awful story made a familiar, awful sense to me. And I wanted to see if they could help each other, if they could work together to help me write this poem, basically. I really don't know much more about it than that. It was this weird notion that seemed to come from somewhere that helped me to move through those two sets of material in a way that I hadn't thought of doing before.
In a way, that's kind of what you do you take the personal, the intimate, which is so beautiful in Ordinary Spirit. I keep seeing those pewter quails on the coffee table, and that intimate space of love. And then here we have the DuPont, the devastation that we deal with, and yet in your poetry from the beginning, you find a way to move, that they move together in us. And your poetry makes that, and makes it in a way that shows us, again, reminds us who we are, and reminds us of this larger wild thing that inspires us and keeps us going. And thank you so much for this time, for being here with Santa Fe.
Oh, thank you.
Let me stand up.
Okay.
And do a take of it.